everyone. Welcome to the Gateway Spotlight, a show designed to highlight diverse perspectives and next generation initiatives, innovative thinkers in international higher education. I'm your host, Brooke Roberts. So excited to be back online with everyone here at the Gateway Spotlight. So welcome everyone. If you're in the chat, if you're joining us, please say hello. Let us know where you are tuning in from. Don't be shy. I will wait if we need to. So we're going to get started here in just a second. And I want to know from the audience, if you're tuning in, are you involved in pathway programs already? And what's your experience with pathway programs on a 1 to 5 scale? 1 being completely new, you're here to learn the basics. 5 being you're a pro, you should be on this panel, you know everything about pathway programs. I'd love to know where you sit in that spectrum. So I see Avery is here, Sherry is here, David is here from Study Me. Welcome, David. And Onur, I hope I said your name correctly. Welcome everyone to the show. So I'll wait for you all to chime in the chat with some of your comments and what you're tuning in from. And we will get this party started, as they say. So I'm your host, Brooke Roberts. Along with hosting this show, I'm also Director of International Education at Johnson County Community College and founder of Inside Study Abroad. Today, we're asking the question, is there a future for pathway programs in global student mobility? And we have a great guest today that I'm going to introduce in just a second. But before we do that, I want to thank today's sponsor, which is Study Me. And I want to tell you all about it. So they're basically an organization that's going to help you take your international recruitment to the next level. Study Me is a one-of-a-kind recruitment platform designed to help schools meet their recruitment goals by using the platform to find the right students by country, study level, program, and more. It's trusted by over 30,000 students last year. And on Study Me, students create a comprehensive profile, including their academic qualifications, English proficiency, study aspirations, and their budget. Then they wait for the best fit schools to contact them. If you want to start today, head to studyme.com, or you can contact David by emailing david@studyme.com, and he'll be happy to give you a demo and a tour of the platform. So thank you so much, Study Me, for supporting this show. And we're dive into our topic today, all about pathway programs. And we have an amazing guest who is a guru, if you will, on pathway programs. And he's going to give us a great rundown of the history of these pathway programs, some of the successes and failures they've experienced over the years, how the pandemic has impacted these programs as it has impacted every program that we offer, and of course what's the plan moving forward for these organizations. So Alan Preece is our guest. He has extensive experience at the C-suite level and operates as an independent consultant, providing advice on strategy, marketing, and operational performance to education, talent acquisition, and edtech companies. His View from a Bridge.org blog, which we will link to in the chat if you want to go check it out, offers insights on global education, organizational management, and his expat life in San Diego. So why we wanted Alan to be our guest and expert on today's topic is because he's been a senior director with 2 different global pathway operators and led complex, globally dispersed operations while working with a wide range of universities in the UK and the US on pathway programs. Before that, though, he led global marketing and student recruitment operations for 2 UK universities. So he's been on both sides of that table. And beyond all that, he has an MS in psychology, lives in San Diego, plays guitar very poorly, so says he, I'm reading his bio, and is a huge fan of Manchester United FC. Welcome to the show, Alan.
Hi there, Brooke. Very, very good to be here.
Great. Well, you have a great history and lots of knowledge on this topic to share with everyone. So I really appreciate you being here. If you're just joining us, please let us know in the chat where you're tuning in from and what your role is or what your interest level is in pathway programs. Do you already work with pathway programs? Are you exploring this as an option for your institution? Tell us a little bit about what your interest is in pathway programs in the chat. Thanks so much for being here. I see who just joined. We have Alex, Sherry, I already mentioned, Christopher, Deepa, Eddie, Gretchen, John, Peter, Sanam, Tiffany, Tim, everyone to the conversation. So before we dive into discussing pathway programs, Alan, tell us a little bit about your international ed story. How did you get involved in international education and kind of discover this little world of ours?
Well, my deep background is in commercial organisations, and I came into the university sector with the University of East Anglia in the 1990s. And then in conversation with the Vice Chancellor, Professor Sir David Eastwood, who's now the chair of INTU, I made the claim that I could do much better on international recruitment than the organisation in the institution that was running it. So he rather called my bluff and said, "Have at it." So I set about, and yeah, we did pretty well. We doubled the numbers of international students over the course of 3 years. And we also introduced the first ever INTU joint venture partnership in the UK. So that was at the University of East Anglia. I then moved on to Queen's University in Belfast, which is a very different university, a Russell Group university, but in an interesting part of the UK, where I set about doing exactly the same thing. So once you've done it at 2 universities, you think you should probably move on. And I was invited to join INTU at that point, where I was the global marketing director and eventually became the chief operating officer for their European operations. So I worked on the other side of the fence and saw some of the issues that can emerge from that. And then I was headhunted out of there to Oxford International Education Group, where I was CEO of the academic division, where we were very much in a startup mode with institutions and bringing them on board at really a very different stage in the development of pathway operations in the UK. So after doing that for a bit, I came to the US. I got married, fell in love, got married, and came to San Diego, which I've also fallen in love with. And then there was the opportunity to really look and study the data in great detail across the pathway sector and the higher education sector. And that's led to some very interesting conversations because you find lots of people are interested. And it's given me an even broader insight into some of the things that are going on and some of the things that are going well and some of the things which are changing very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Great. So let's back up a step for those listening or watching. Can you give us a basic foundation of what is a pathway program? What does it do? What's its purpose? How do they come on the scene of international ed? Give us that foundational knowledge and understanding.
Well, they're constantly developing, but right at the start, if you go back to the late 90s and into the 2000s, they became popular in the UK and Australia for a number of reasons. But it's worth remembering always that the UK and Australia are countries where universities take students after 13 years of schooling. Now, most of the major source markets, and particularly China at the time, have a 12-year school system. So you end up with this year where the universities can't really take them because of their own rules and regulations. And quite often they are short on language and study skills. So the pathway year, or the foundation year as it was often called, became a very useful way of using that year to give the students improved language capability, but also to give them academic study skills which would help them as they entered the degree program that they went into. And so that year became very important, and that's really why Australia and UK were the heart and the home of the pathway programs, with companies like Navitas, INTU, Study Group, all the names that are still around. And then latterly, it began to develop in the US, and of course there are some in Canada as well. Where we then saw a later stage of development with particularly Shorelight, which has become a very big name in the US, becoming one of the major pathway operators. I think it's worth saying, though, that the type of program has morphed and developed over time. So it's not uncommon now in the UK, for example, to see effectively a 4-year degree program, which starts as an international year 1 with the pathway operator. And that's because the university may not want to take the student until they've got a language level at, say, 6 IELTS, whereas the pathway operator can take them at 5.5, which is still within the visa regulations. And it means actually the student only has to have 1 visa over their 4 years, which of course is an advantage to them. So you continue to see developments over time.
So early in the beginning, when people realize, okay, if we're going to match up the students we're trying to recruit and their educational level with our educational system, were universities running these at first and then discovering, wow, this is a heavy lift. We don't have the resources to really do this well. And then companies were on the scene? Or was this a problem that companies saw right away and offered it as a product to universities? Does that make sense? Like what came first?
Well, a number of universities, and indeed the University of East Anglia before we became involved with Into, had language studies departments, and of course the ELIs in the US are pretty strong. And so there was a way in which students could get their language development supported before going into degrees. But once again, you see this slight difference that in the UK, it was never really part of the academic institution. It was clearly pre-degree level, whereas because US institutions are used to taking students after 12 years of study, they could begin to develop it in a way that gave credit. And I think that's a fundamental difference. At the start, it was not the case that pathways would have any credit as part of their foundation year towards a UK degree, because it would be entirely pre-degree study.
Yeah. So that leads me right into my next question of sort of breaking down the difference between the UK and Australian implementation of pathway programs versus the US and maybe Canada as well. And it sounds like it's that difference between the 13 and 12-year pre-university study tenure, if you will.
Yeah, generally speaking, it's whether or not the work you're doing in that year carries credit towards your degree. And it would have been the case, generally speaking, in the UK and Australia, that it wouldn't. Right. Whereas in the US, because it effectively came into a 4-year undergraduate degree system, then it would carry some aspect of credit. As I mentioned earlier, though, there have been developments latterly, and particularly so in the UK, because of the developing visa situation. And I'm sure we'll come on later as to how the geopolitics of these things begin to change the way companies respond, that you do now have effectively 4-year degrees in the UK, where the pathway operator offers the first year of that degree before the student goes into the rest of their work with the university.
Interesting. Yeah. So, okay. So let's talk a little bit about, I guess, the struggle of pathway programs, specifically in the United States. I know we're going to talk about the pandemic in a second because that's its own beast. But even before the pandemic, I know and I recall in the field I remember the big push. I remember Into being everywhere, and especially my friends in international student and scholar services and international admissions talking a lot about these organizations coming onto the scene, universities signing these great long-term partnerships with these outside orgs to offer this service. And it was a very mixed bag, if you will, in the United States. And can you talk a little bit about, am I way off base? Let's just start there. And second, what what was the reception of these programs into the United States? And I know you played a role in that. You were sort of an insider in all of this. And then what made some of these partnerships flounder?
At first, there was huge success. I think, it has to be said that when Into began with Oregon State University, it was a very significant success. I
Was
think
that their first foray into the US market?
in the US, yes, and yeah, partly because it unleashed a latent demand, and it had a very, very powerful recruitment network around the world. So Oregon State was the first university for Into who got the full benefit of that. There was also a sense of a full university response. Oregon State really wanted to do this work and supported it, I think, very, very ably. And then following that, with the University of South Florida, very similar thing. There was a very, very powerful push within the university to make sure that it worked. And in those early days, of course, you can just, because there's demand to come to the US, and the US has always been popular with international students, working with universities that would enable that process, I think was a very powerful aspect of the early success. As you move beyond that, of course, it's the question is partly what partners can you get, and the truth is there are universities in the US, indeed any country, who simply don't need pathway operators. Their brand reputation, their name, or the work they've done means that they really don't need the help at all. And then there are universities who will always struggle because they're either they don't have the ranking, the reputation, or indeed the courses that are in demand from the international market. So pathway operators tended to be looking for the sweet spot, somewhere in the middle. And then you begin to bump into universities who may not want to be as active in supporting it, may not want to adjust their course profile. And that begins to get a little bit more difficult. And all the time, your sales team is having to carry more universities as they go around the agents and talking to students. So you've got more mouths to feed, and it can get much more complex. And you're trying to differentiate between them, but it's not easy. The truth is, it's not easy when you're carrying a lot of products in your bag to sell them all with equal vigor. So I think that we saw that happen. And of course, competition really developed. Canada began to really grow very rapidly, which meant that there was more competition. You saw interesting competition coming out of Europe. Germany has grown very quickly, its international student population. And then latterly, China, of course, began to really grow the number of international students that it was prepared to take. So the US unleashed latent demand. Then competition began to develop, not only between countries, but Shorelight came onto the scene in just after, probably 2 or 3 years after Into had started. So there was an awful lot of competition out there, and that begins to drive up the cost of doing business. Because the agents who most operators work with, the international recruitment agents, are able to charge higher commissions. So actually your cost of acquisition goes up, and it gets to be, as a business model, gets more and more complex.
Yeah. And I know too, like just anecdotally chatting with people, who've worked in recruitment, in-house within institutions, that sometimes partnering even with agents, even outside of, these bigger companies like Into or Shorelight, they lose a little bit of that passion and connection for the institution. If they're going to India and touring around and talking to students in high schools, and they work on the campus and they know the campus and they're so passionate about what the campus can offer the students, that just hits different than an agent who may have never even visited that campus, but can tell all the facts and figures and about it. So I know that just outsourcing that process generally, I think, is challenging at some institutions, for at least some individuals I've chatted with who just know that they lose a little bit of that special sauce of recruitment, that you lose a little bit there. I'd love to chat a little bit about, fast forwarding now. So the scene has been set, at least in the US market. And now a global pandemic hits. And so maybe you can talk through a little bit about specifically for pathway programs globally, what was the broader impact, aside from students aren't moving, but did it impact these organizations in terms of their value proposition and how they were able to thrive or not during that time?
And a huge disruption to the whole issue of global mobility. And of course, it fundamentally meant that for most pathways who were reliant upon traveling to agent offices in country, that travel became virtually impossible in most cases. And so their opportunity to exercise those networks in a way that had been highly productive declined very, very quickly. And then, of course, the students themselves weren't able to move either. So you ended up with a totally artificial scenario. And I think I think the interesting thing is, because the pandemic was such an unusual set of circumstances, the other factor that emerged was the growth of what became known as the aggregators, which are the edtech recruitment solution. And of course, if nobody can travel, then the only way to try and do anything is through technology. And I think that the most interesting thing about the pandemic is really what happens next, because there is such an appetite for people to return to international travel, to return to face-to-face engagement, that it will be very interesting to see if the growth of the aggregators is really taken away by the differences. And we saw recently, for example, Into launched in Vietnam their university access centers. They plan to have 13 by the end of next year. And that's very clearly, and they state this very clearly, because they believe that face-to-face is a very, very powerful way of attracting students to go to particular universities. And I think that that's a point of differentiation from the aggregators. And I'm sure it will lead to an increased amount of in-country activity in areas such as employability, which I also believe will be interesting going forward. So I think we're at a point where we're emerging from the pandemic. That accelerated a number of issues around edtech. It accelerates the amount of online delivery of programs, for example. But as we move forward, I suspect we will see a large degree of the old order being reinstated, but with some nuances and some difference, which exploit some of those trends.
Mm-hmm. Well, that leads me perfectly into our next question. But before we get to that, I just want to tell the audience you're very quiet today. So say hello in the chat so we know you're awake and you're here with us. But also, we are going to take questions. So if there's anything that we haven't hit on, if there's a burning question that you want to ask, please throw it in the chat so we can talk about it when we finish up with the main part of our interview here. So please let us know. Please be engaged. We want to make sure that you learn what you came here to learn from this episode. So Alan, I want you to put on your consulting hat. You do this all the time, so this should be easy. And talk us through, if you were advising a pathway program, either provider or an institution that's utilizing pathway programs, what would be your game plan or your playbook, if you will, going into the next few academic years? What do you think they should be doing?
The first and most important thing has always been that there's a whole institution approach. I think that where pathways have tended to struggle is where the institution has seen them as some sort of addendum or side issue. And you sometimes hear the phrase from universities that it's non-core business. Well, frankly, if it's a funnel into the university, it is core business. And I think institutions have to really think hard about how they're going to maximize that opportunity. And I think most pathway operators would agree that where you have a like-minded management team in a university that is able to bring the academic community along with it, that is where you get real successes. Because you see things like, the influence of a professor traveling to an agent's office or to counsel students is extraordinary. I mean, when you sit there, you see this real shine coming through that says, wow, this is the place for me. If this professor can be bothered to come to this country to talk to me, then that's the right thing. So I think the most fundamental thing is that the institution has to believe in it and has to be prepared to do what is appropriate in terms of academic programming and student support that makes it real and most effective. And there are some very good examples of that have gone on, and perhaps we'll come to that at some point. Yeah. I think the next most important thing is that universities have to not think of the degree as the end product for the student, because actually students are often taking the qualification in order to have a better life, and whether that's because they want more choices in their life, or they just want to get a good job, or they want to go into a certain career. This is a stepping stone along the way. It is not an end point for them. And I think we've already seen pathway operators begin to look at the employability issue. But frankly, many universities need to work a lot harder, not just at employability in country if there are post-study work rights, but also about employability as the individual goes back to their own country. So I think employability and data around it, how do you prove that your institution's degree ends up with somebody getting a good job or a good career? That data needs to be collected more assiduously, and I think many people are still in their infancy in that. There are services that can support them, and I think it's going to be very, very important that people look at it. After that, I think everybody has to look very flexibly at the opportunities that exist. Are there more opportunities for transnational education where you get a foothold in a country with a satellite operation? Do you offer degrees there or part degrees there where people can finish their studies in country? Do you offer undergraduate degrees, but you then try and secure a flow to your postgraduate opportunities back in the home country? What can you do with online? Is online going to actually move into virtual reality? And so, I think there are some really quite interesting technological developments, but I suspect there's a leapfrogging from what has been a rather forced approach to online in some cases because of the pandemic into where are we going to be in 5 or 10 years' time, and how can that really make the student experience a very powerful one, which is if they are studying in countries, which is more like being there in the home university. So I think there are those are three of the things I'd be looking at. I'd be looking at whole university approaches. I'd be looking at employability and routes to careers, and I would be looking really hard at where the technology might lead you and how you balance that with a physical in-country presence.
I love that, mixing the where we imagine the physicality of where students, when they go abroad, what does that actually mean, and redefining those pathways, if you will, pun intended. So,
Brooke, if I mean, the other thing that occurs to me, which I think we're going to see more and more, we're seeing, particularly with Canada, we've seen the power of both post-study work rights, but also routes to citizenship. We're seeing Australia talking about extending their post-study work rights. There's a very significant lobby in the UK for the UK government to change its post-study work rights so that people can stay for longer after they've studied. I think universities have to really work very, very closely together to try to ensure that the government is setting an appropriate environment which is attractive to international students. So that's not individual institutions, because I think very rarely do they win. Yeah. I think that the ability to influence government policy in a way that makes a country attractive is going to be powerful, because many countries are beginning to see global student mobility as a real route, both to soft power, but also to economic advantage in the longer term future. And it's going to be a country by country game as much as it's an institution by institution game.
Well, and I will say it, my personal opinion here, I just does not represent Gateway's opinion, but I will say that I think the United States is losing that battle on many fronts, or that war on many fronts. Just not only like policy level, in terms of tightening what it means for students to continue their careers or even their studies, the number of visas we're even willing to issue, but also just like the dynamics of the United States that make it really unattractive for people to come here. So we won't make this too political, but I would say that, yeah, the United States has a long way to go until we're really competitive in that regard, I would say. So I don't know, thoughts?
Well, it's interesting. If you imagine the US had the current Canadian government approach to international students and moves to citizenship, the US would clean up. You know, it would be not a fair combat, because the attraction of the US to international students is huge. And you know, obviously I read, as everybody does, a slightly downbeat approach, and nobody wants to come here, and the competition is too difficult. Well, I think there are things that would change. Now, my own view is that the US will continue to see an uptick over the coming years, because it remains so attractive. And of course, there are always going to be issues around how expensive is it to study there, and some of the housekeeping stuff, but that doesn't undermine the main attraction of the country. And
you don't think the societal level issues deter?
Well, people may be aware of some of the issues in Northern Ireland when I was at Queen's University Belfast, and you know that was presented very in a very difficult way for us on most of the news channels, but students still wanted to come because they want a good quality education. And of course, there are many students who see in their own country divisions and difficulties, and I think that one can overstate how much that they might be put off by what's going on in your own country. So we worked very hard in Belfast to ensure that people understood that yes, there were, we never denied there were isolated incidents in Northern Ireland. But fundamentally, we talked about the quality of the education, the quality of the support and the care that we wanted to be able to give them. And we ensured we had the programs and the pricing. Yeah, there are some fundamentals about programs, pricing that has to be right for the market. But I think getting sucked into being downbeat about your country or certain places in the country just isn't very productive.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I just was giving my commentary. It's my hot take, Alan. You are the king of the hot takes. So that's a great transition. I'm waiting for our audience to chime in with some questions or comments, specifically around pathway programs. So we're going to shift gear a little bit, and I wanted to ask you about your blog. So you're known for having some saucy hot takes on topics in international higher education. I've seen some of your comments on posts, for instance, on LinkedIn. And of course, you write blog commentary about that. I think there are a lot of people in our field, and I know this is very true in the United States, but you know, your experience in the UK would be insightful here too. I think a lot of people would be really nervous to publish seemingly controversial or contrarian opinions online, like as a permanent record. What advice do you have for other professionals nervous about putting out their commentary, their thought leadership that may not jive with everyone?
Well, anybody who goes to the top page of the blog will see that I've got a quote from a DACA student, which says, "Speak because it's your life, speak because you can." And it strikes me that there are so many people in the world who are oppressed or their views are suppressed. And if you have the ability to say things, then you should give serious thought to doing it. I think the second thing is that I feel in many cases the media in the sector is reticent to take on and speak truth to power. I think that quite often they're also financially, because they rely on advertising or other things. There are some media that find it very, very difficult to speak, and so what I try to do is I try to be data-based. I try to deal in facts, and then I try to have an opinion about those facts, which I think is hopefully adding some insight or some value to the conversation. I've always said on the blogs that if I've got something wrong, someone should tell me, and I'm more than happy to correct it publicly, because I think that's part of, we're meant to be in a sector, in higher education in particular, we're meant to be in a sector where people deal in opinions and facts and data and insights in a way that is not personal. It's in a way that says what value can I add, and where will this take us forward? And I passionately believe in trying to make sure that the students are getting the best deal. I like to make sure that there's transparency, there's openness, and they understand what that best deal looks like. And I also want universities to think very hard about their reputations, both in the short and the longer term, and not get sucked into thinking that they're solely commercial institutions who only want international students because of the economic benefit they bring to the university. I want them to think very hard about what's right for those students and how they can add value. And of course, many universities do. Most people I speak to in the sector care deeply about students, and they care deeply about international students and understand the issues. So, but I want to add to that story, and that's why I do it. And if nobody read it, I'd probably still write it, because I find this sector totally fascinating.
Yeah, I agree. I started Inside Study Abroad as a blog in 2009, and it was just commentary of what I was seeing in the field. And I would tell everybody all day long is to start a platform where you do share your insights and understanding at whatever level you're at. You might be a newbie and you're just like noticing things for the first time. But I think you're right. I think there's a way to do it where, of course, you're going to do it in a polite way. Of course, you're going to do it in a constructive way. You're no name calling here, but you can also have an opinion that might not be what, everyone, the kumbaya, if you will, version of how sometimes we can speak in academia in general. And, I'd say, just like Alan said, I think if you have an opinion, your voice should be heard, and share it. Just put it out there. It looks like we've had a few questions come in, but they're not hitting me. I see notes saying, hey, please post this in the chat, but I can't see them, y'all. So when you post them, they're not going to me. So please put them. Hey, Elena, people have just been raising their hands. I see. Okay. I don't know. This is now technology where I'm like, if I click on someone, do they get to come on screen? Is that how this works, guys? Oh, hi, Alex, you're in. Sorry, I gave you 0 warning there. But if you are okay talking, please, what's your question?
Hey, Brooke, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
And apologies, I'm in a train station, so if it's a little bit loud. Thank you, both of you, for this. And Alan, really, really interesting to hear your take on it. My question is around the recent trend in the US, where we've seen Pathway is hit, if you like, in 2 ways. One is that there's an increasing concern from students from core markets like China and India, where students worry about the progression from Pathway into the university and want the certainty of direct admit, because they feel that gives them either from a visa perspective or from a progression perspective greater certainty to complete their degree. And secondly, where institutions who offer direct admit appear to be lowering grade standards anecdotally to students so they don't need to go through Pathway. And this is a phenomenon seen not just with the US, but also across the UK and Australia as well. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that phenomenon that we've seen in the last 12 months.
Yes, thanks, Alex. I think all of those things are right. Students will always be looking for the most certain way to get to where they want to go. I think one of the fascinating other developments is the number of choice options that are developing for students in the US. I was always told that the US would never get to be in that position, but I think that day is coming. But also inevitably, I think universities are thinking, actually, can we get a better slice of this, which means we don't have to give anything away to pathway operators. That's part of the reality of universities having to look very carefully at their finances. I think those things will continue. I also think that we'll see higher ranked or medium ranked universities increasingly trying to take market share from lower ranked universities. We've seen that certainly in the UK with home students, and I don't see any reason why that wouldn't be true of international students. So I think the squeeze will continue. And the only real thing that universities will keep thinking about is, can they afford the coverage that pathway operators with international recruitment teams can offer them? And I think that's why we're seeing so many of the pathway operators move into direct recruitment. I think Shoreline now has something like 40 partners, of whom only 9 are full service pathway operations. They've got a huge growth in direct recruitment. The question is, and this goes back to my point about how many products have you got in your bag, can their sales team do justice to 40 different brands? And I think that's an issue. And I think when universities find that doesn't work for them, they'll be forced back to look at their own resources and ways in which they can get on the road and differentiate.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, we do have to wrap up. Thank you, Alex, for coming on live. That was kind of fun. We've never done that before. We might have to do that in the future as well. Thank you, Alan. This was incredibly informative for me. I hope the audience got a lot out of it. Of course, everyone, if you want to connect with Alan and continue this conversation, you can visit him at his blog, which we've linked to, but also connect with him on LinkedIn. For the recording and the show notes, we will have links to all the things we've talked about. So you can go and discover those. And of course, I want to thank today's sponsor, StudyMe. Definitely go check them out, studyme.com. And their team, David in particular, is there to work with you. So you can email him at david@studyme.com as well. And thanks again, Alan. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks, Brooke. Enjoyed it greatly. Alex, make sure you get your train. And thank you to all colleagues who tuned in. It was great fun. Thank you.